Hey, I'm Mateo. For my video, I'm going to be explaining a concept that I came across a couple of weeks ago. A very interesting article from The Economist, basically talking about this index of social progressiveness, to per se, called the SPI, Social Progress Index. So throughout the class, I think this is a really important topic because it incorporates two big themes of our class. First of all, the importance of non-financial, non-economic measures in economic development, separating it from some variables such as income with other variables such as health, education, that in the end improve capabilities. And second of all, figuring it out, like different methods that we could actually measure these capabilities, that we can actually compare across different dimensions and different places. And I think this SPI index does a really good job about to explain that. So what is it? It's an index that relates GDP per capita with something called the SPI. The index includes everything from environmental policies to levels to measure religious tolerance, gender equality, a bunch of non-quantitative factors that you would actually not see in other development measures. So it shows a positive correlation. It obviously shows that countries with more levels of social progressiveness tend to have higher incomes per capita. But there's some really interesting stuff we can see from the graph. We can see how there's obviously some outliers, good outliers, bad outliers. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So there's a little sketch of the graph kind of to see how it looks like. You have the social progress index on the y-axis and the GDP per capita on the x-axis. There's a positive correlation at some point. It increases, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. Like GDP per capita tends to stall, as we have seen in other models in the class. And most of the points, they follow this correlation, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about the interesting points that don't really follow this correlation. For example, we got countries like right here, for example. We got countries like Saudi Arabia. We got the UAE here. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Qatar. You basically got countries from the Persian Gulf there. Very high levels of GDP per capita, but not much going on in social progress index. This just goes with the idea that development and social progress does not necessarily mean income, and it's just makes us try to redefine what development is by evaluating these types of outliers. But as we see negative examples, but we also see countries that are actually doing things really well in terms of social progress without high GDPs per capita. Most impressive example in my experience, Costa Rica. At the end of the day, it's a Latin American development country, but they have been doing things really, really well throughout the year in comparison to most of Latin America. Really low corruption levels, really high ecotourism business, probably one of the most sustainable countries in the world in terms of sustainable development. So they're doing things really well. And as you imagine, you can find also some countries up here with a little bit of higher GDPs, but also really high social welfare measures, such as Finland. You got Sweden. So this just goes a little bit more with the idea that it's important to go beyond these points. It's important to distinguish the reasons that we got points like these. What lessons do these countries teach us? Do you need to have a high GDP per capita to have a high social progress index? Not necessarily. Does having a high GDP per capita imply a high level of social progress? Not necessarily. That's why governments must improve their policies in terms of religious tolerance, sustainable development, gender equality, to actually try to follow this curve and not be identified as, the negative outliers, the guys that are doing things wrong. So yeah, I thought this was a really interesting graph. I think it perfectly sums up many of the ideas we've been discussing in class, how it's important to distinguish between economic development and economic growth, and how there's so many indicators that go into this, that go into identifying countries that have developed sustainable development policies. So thanks, and I hope you enjoyed the video.